I'm David Garland. I'm Dean of the Triad Seminary here at Baylor, and I think I'm old enough to be able to say that our speaker today needs no introduction and then to sit down. And I don't think he would mind, because one of our students said last year when he gave the parchment lectures at the seminary, he was standing behind him toward the end of a line, and he was awestruck. And our speaker turned around and said to him, "Hi, I'm Walt." Walter Brueggemann is the son of a German evangelical minister. He grew up in Blackburn, Missouri, worked as a farmhand baling hay, worked in cornfields, worked in a dairy farm, drove teams of horses, and worked at a filling station. He graduated from Elmhurst College, and if you can judge the quality of an institution by its distinguished alumni, Richard and Reinhold Niebuhr also graduated from this school. He received his Bachelor of Divinity from Eden Seminary in St. Louis, where he later served as a professor and then dean from 1961 to 1986. He then became William Marcellus McPheeters Professor of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, and is now Professor Emeritus. He received his THD from Union Seminary in New York and his PhD from St. Louis University, and he promised to mention nothing about the St. Louis Cardinals. He has served as president of the Society of Biblical Literature. He's an honorary member of the British Society for Old Testament Study. He's a member of the Martin Luther King Jr. Collegium for Scholars of Morehouse University College. And as a Navy veteran, I am most impressed that he was inducted as an admiral in the Nebraska Navy, the vaunted and much feared naval fleet. I tried to count his books, and when I hit 70, I lost count. I did it again, and I finally gave up. But he's written over 70 books. I think 4 more are due out in the next 8 months. I did not even try to count the number of articles, professional articles, journal articles he's published. The number of distinguished lectureships he has delivered over the years approaches 60. And as a scholar, one of the greatest tributes you can receive is to be honored with a Festschrift. And Dr. Brueggemann has received 2 Festschriften, a collection of essays that are written by other notable scholars and published to toast a professor of note and merit. The first one came out in 1998, God in the Fray, a tribute to Walter Brueggemann, published by Fortress Press. And then in 2010, last year, The Center and the Periphery, a European tribute to Walter Brueggemann, published by Sheffield Phoenix Press. He is clearly a scholar who is appreciated and honored by the Academy. To me, what is most important, that he has been and continues to be a scholar for the church. He has 2 sons, 5 grandchildren. I consider that a full quiver. And according to Psalm 127, that confirms that he is blessed. But he has blessed so many others with his clear, incisive, inspiring, prophetic interpretation of Holy Scriptures. He said his favorite verse in the Bible was the confirmation verse that he received, Psalm 119, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." He has helped aim that light before us as we also walk our way with God. Would you welcome Dr. Walter Brueggemann?
It's a huge honor and privilege for me to get to be in this distinguished conference on this distinguished campus, and I am delighted to get to be here with you. It was very late in the 7th century BCE in the ancient city of Jerusalem. It was late only a few years before the destruction of the city, when its walls were breached, the temple destroyed, the king deported, and the political state of Judah ended. It was very late for the ancient city of Jerusalem because the city was being devoured by greedy corruption, of which the poet Jeremiah could say, "From the least to the greatest, everyone is greedy for unjust gain. They have treated the wound of my people carelessly, saying, 'Peace, peace,' when there is no peace." It was very late for the ancient city of Jerusalem because the city was under threat at the hands of the aggressive Babylonian armies, of which the poet Jeremiah had God say, "I am about to bring against you a nation far away. It is an enduring nation. It is an ancient nation. It is a nation whose language you do not know." Now, this is only poetry, and the poet does not even name the coming enemy evoked by the will of God. The description of a language that you do not know that will eat you up sounds like Al-Qaeda, but it is likely in context Babylon. More than greedy corruption and external threat, the poetic tradition of Jeremiah dares to connect the two. Because of greedy corruption, therefore enemy threat. The God who presides over the historical process in poetic imagination connects and enacts what we would analyze differently. The outcome of such an odd reasoning is that internal anti-neighborliness yields external risk and danger. It was very late in Jerusalem, according to prophetic anticipation, and if one were such a poet, if one were Jeremiah, what would one say after poetry about greedy exploitation and after poetry of external threat dispatched by holy resolve? Well, this is what the poet Jeremiah says in the midst of that lateness. "Do not let the wise," here's our theme, "boast in their wisdom. Do not let the mighty boast in their might. Do not let the wealthy boast in their wealth." The poet focuses upon the great triad of control and pride, the three facets of having one's way in the world: might, wisdom, and wealth. Might here means military force, the capacity to control markets and natural resources. Wealth means the capacity to manage capital and impose requirements and restraints and leverage on all of the others so that the whole of the global economy is ordered to flow toward us. But then wisdom. We had not expected wisdom to come along with might and wealth, especially because our theme is wisdom and the work of the university is wisdom. Who could speak negatively of wisdom when we remember our great intellectual inheritance from the Greeks? But of course, when wisdom is situated amid might and wealth, something happens to wisdom. And of course, that is what has happened among us. We have understood with Bacon that knowledge is power, and we have transposed wisdom into knowledge that could control. That strange interplay between wisdom and knowledge has brought us the gift of the great scientific revolution in Bacon's time, and in its wake, the great technological advances that have moved toward control that is never disinterested. And before we knew it, Walter Isaacson and Evan Thomas have entitled a book, "The Wise Men," a study of 6 of the titanic figures who have managed U.S. foreign policy with Niebuhrian realism and have produced the abiding superpower, ample wisdom, ample might, ample wealth in order to be the chosen race in the modern world. Perhaps inevitably the great universities have signed on with that wisdom, have entered into compacts of wisdom that has brought university the wealth of research grants and the power of connectedness. And now we are sobered, as we are in this consultation, needing to take a deep breath concerning the way of wisdom, enlightenment, knowledge to which we have been pledged. That wisdom has led us to immense power and wealth. But it has also led us to the sad picture of Lyndon Johnson in his last days concerning Vietnam, with his head in his hands, completely exasperated with ineffective power. It has led to the verdict of the brothers Bundy, McGeorge, and William, architects of that war, who wrote at the end of their book, "We were good, but we were not as good as we thought we were." It has led to the departure of the wise men from the White House after conferring with the president about Vietnam and without a clue of what to do next. It has led to the oil spills and to the Japanese nuclear crisis and to the widespread suspicion that our technology has outrun our capacity to think clearly. And it has led us with deep anxiety that seeks scapegoats along with the zeal to dispose of the others, if necessary, by violence. And the poet says, "Do not boast about your might, do not boast about your wisdom, do not boast about your wealth." But what then? Well, if we take the antithesis of might, wealth, and wisdom, we might come up with a triad of weakness, foolishness, and poverty. And of course, that's what we get in Jesus of Nazareth. For God chose foolishness that is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. First, you know the gracious act of our Lord Jesus Christ, who though rich, yet for our sake became poor, so that by his poverty he might make ready rich. It turns out that the life of the crucified one exhibits the counterpoint to the great seduction of Jerusalem. He is the embodiment of weakness as he stood vulnerable before imperial authority. He is the embodiment of foolishness. Terry Eagleton describes him this way: "Unlike most responsible American citizens, Jesus appears to do no work, is accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. He is presented as homeless, propertyless, celibate, peripatetic, socially marginal, disdainful of kinfolk, without a trade, a friend of outcasts and pariahs, averse to material possessions, without fear for his own safety, careless about purity regulations, critical of traditional authority, a thorn in the side of the establishment, and a scourge of the rich and powerful. The morality Jesus preaches is reckless, extravagant, improvident, over the top, a scandal to actuaries, and a stumbling block to real estate agents. Forgive your enemies, give away your cloak as well as your coat, turn the other cheek, love those who insult you, walk the extra mile, take no thought for tomorrow." So far, Eagleton. He is the embodiment of poverty with nowhere to lay his head or even health care. The remembered Jesus sits amid our posturing. It reminds us that the great imperial triad of might, wisdom, and wealth never delivers the security or the happiness that it promises. But I will not linger over that counter triad of weakness, foolishness, and poverty that waits silently for us, because that triad is too outrageous and too remote from our business at hand. Instead, I will consider the counter triad that Jeremiah in his poetry lines out. It has a kind of available realism that is lacking in Jesus of Nazareth, a realism that permits people like us to take it seriously. Jeremiah says, "But let those who boast in this, that they understand and know me, that I am the Lord, that I act with steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, says the Lord." This counter triad is rooted in the reality of the Lord, the God of Israel, who is celebrated as the great deliverer from slavery and the creator of heaven and earth. And, says the poet, even in the midst of greedy corruption and external threat, some know. They are the ones who boast of my stuff. They know me. They have entered into covenant with me. They have acknowledged my will and purpose, and they understand me. They can factor out the implications of who I am and what I will. And that is what makes the tradition endlessly compelling. They were the ones who gave Jeremiah trouble through the night, and buoyancy through the day. What they know and understand is that I act with steadfast love, justice, and righteousness. I delight in those things. And because I delight in those things, this people and this city are under mandate to live them out. Out of the deep covenantal tradition of Israel, Jeremiah offers a triad of fidelity that stands counter to the triad of control that was destroying Israel. It is very late in Jerusalem, but nobody knows if it is too late. Sometimes the poets like Jeremiah said it was too late. Too late for the Ethiopian to change his skin. Too late for the leopard to change its spots. Too late for the Solomonic regime to repent. Too late because of internal corruption and external threat. At other times, these same poets thought it was late, but not too late, that the urgent task was to move the body politic with its marching armies and its blessing priests and its cunning scribes away from the triad of control toward the triad of covenantal fidelity. And when that move is made, then a new historical possibility might yet be available because it is very late. The university sits in a society where it is very late. The university sits in a society that is in large committed to the triad of might, wisdom, and wealth. And in some measure, the university, like the church, has colluded in that triad to its great benefit. The lateness of the hour invites the university, like the wayward son in a far country, to come to its senses, to remember its home and its belonging and its vocation, to live alertly and knowingly in a very late moment amid these competing triads of control and fidelity, knowing that both are powerful and both are compelling and both are indispensable. But because the triad of control has carried the day in our society without much critical reflection, it may be the great tilt of the university to give priority to the triad of fidelity that has nearly disappeared from the public face of our society as it disappeared from the public face of Jerusalem. It will be my purpose here to line out, in as many ways as I can think of the interface of these two triads that concerned the poet and that might usefully concern our society where it is very late. With our conference theme of wisdom, we engage two competing notions of wisdom, the wisdom of enlightenment control on the one hand, and the other ancient wisdom that is rooted in the fear of the Lord, two wisdoms that will yield two very different worlds. The wisdom of control we may call fast wisdom, that assumes we are free to manage and shape and administer and master the world. And the wisdom of fidelity that I call slow wisdom, that waits and watches and receives and yields and hopes. Fast wisdom, now paced by electronic urgency, concerns knowing and having and possessing and controlling. Slow wisdom is about serious, engaged relatedness that will not be hurried. It matters decisively if the world is imagined by fast-paced control that breeds greed and resentment, or by slow-paced wisdom that hosts complexity and refuses sound bites. The task of the university, I suggest, is to mediate and adjudicate between these triads, and by such mediation and adjudication to expose the risks and the hazards of the triad of control that has brought our society to the brink of default that is not only financial but moral. The ancient city was in a moral default that could not be sustained. It is no wonder that the poets, given how late it was, wondered whether it was too late or only very late. So here in 8 phrasings, I'm going to say the same thing 8 different ways, is my thought about these 2 triads of might, wisdom, and wealth, and steadfast love, justice, and righteousness. The triad of fidelity, first, focuses on the body, whereas the triad of control focuses characteristically on abstractions of power and possession. The couplet of justice and righteousness are concerned with the ways in which the resources of the community are mobilized for the bodily reality of persons and the healthy reality of the body politic. The materiality of the biblical tradition has to do with the quotidian dimension of the vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, the poor, and the wherewithal for their dignity and well-being. Thus, the indictment in the ancient city, they have grown fat and sleek. They know no limits in deeds of wickedness. They do not judge with justice the cause of the poor. They do not defend the right of the needy. And the same poet says, if you truly amend your ways, if you truly act with justice, if you do not oppress the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood, and if you do not go after other gods, then Jeremiah sees the bodily needs of the vulnerable that require a different ordering of the body politic. Righteousness is weighing in for the well-being of the community. The poetic tradition always cares about food, clothing, and housing. The materiality of this triad refuses the requirements of ideas, concepts, theories, and ideologies that draw energy away from reality of those who stand in front of us. The flight to abstraction is an endless seduction for those in control, so that social reality can be reduced to a program or a budget that depends always on a euphemism to hide the bodily reality next door. The seduction of the university, not unlike the government and the church and the corporation, is to traffic in abstraction. And the challenge of the university is to bring the energy back to that quotidian reality so that resources and passion may be mobilized differently. Second, the triad of fidelity focuses on the neighborhood, whereas the triad of control is drawn to the club. The club is a staging ground for exclusion so that one need deal only with those one chooses who are most like us. It is a mark of privilege that brings with it the sense of knowing best and being right. It proceeds by excluding the other, variously women or blacks or Jews or the poor. And of course, the best universities have been no more hospitable than the clubs with their exclusionary quotas. But the neighborhood takes in all of us who move up and down the street. There is an egalitarian assumption about the legitimacy of all its members and the sharing of resources to which all are entitled. Historically, without romanticizing a rural community, before social stratification and division of labor and the development of surplus wealth, with the exception of the doctor, was more or less an egalitarian community. But the urban reality of social stratification, division of labor, and surplus wealth has largely destroyed that sense of neighborly egalitarianism. And of course, the university is deeply enmeshed with that crisis, for admission is a ticket to entitlement. We can no longer have affirmative action, the urban elite court has ruled, so that the privileged who come from better schools are better prepared for applications and so on. The basis of socially constructed merit can occupy the space and the fellowships. We produce a class of managers of social symbols, of which I am a member, marked out at best by only a vague memory of having done real work. The process of privilege and entitlement evokes a stream of influence that culminates in might and wealth and a certain kind of wisdom. And of course, such a trajectory of control will hide behind 100 defenses of pedigree and certification and gated communities and tenure and all the rest. But the cadences of steadfast love concern the neighbors who are bound together in common need, common resources, and common dignity pledged to common goods. So I am taken with the arguments of Peter Block, who focuses on the mobilization of the neighborhood, by which he means quite concretely the people on the block. His mode of asset-based community is committed to the proposition that the neighborhood, rightly mobilized, has all the assets necessary for the sustenance of healthy existence. Of course, I am aware that every college and every university has endless program opportunities through which students can participate in the neighborhood on the ground. But as we all know, and as students know, such opportunities are marginal and incidental and are at best extraneous to the real requirements and payouts of education. But we have in recent time witnessed the failure of the club. We have witnessed its bailouts in which ordinary taxpayers have footed the bill for the privileged, and it will not do. Thus, I suspect that a shift of emphasis from one triad to the other is a deep and systemic piece of work in the university, the emergent awareness that the might wisdom of the club has in fact failed, and we fall back on the wisdom of the neighborhood that finds might in vulnerability and health in generosity, and vulnerability and generosity are remote from the club that is prone to deny vulnerability and is organized against generosity. Third, the triad of fidelity is deeply situated in the tradition, whereas the triad of control traffics in syllogisms and memos. Syllogisms reflect controlling reason that yields a kind of thin certitude about which there is no argument, and memos are unambiguous notes of power, as David's memo to Joab about the death sentence of Uriah, or Jezebel's memo that was a death sentence for Naboth. Such writing as control is reflected in Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, in which the Okies observe that whenever a man with a clipboard writes something down, you own less. And of course, that process of writing memos continues in our time. Notices from the bank, all of whose writers would like to be neighborly, but the rules preclude it. Since the 17th century, such reasoning has declared war on tradition. And now the assault on tradition continues in the reduction of reality to sound bites, the reduction of hymns to praise hymns, and the delete button that can erase into innocent amnesia. But communities of steadfast love, justice, and righteousness have long memories and deep hopes and do not believe that instantaneous satisfaction is an adequate displacement for remembering and anticipating. Jeremiah calls that tradition the way. Let me go to the rich and speak to them. Surely they know the way of the Lord, the Torah of our God. And then if they will diligently learn the ways of my people and say, as the Lord lives, then they shall be built up. Broadly construed, the way refers to the Torah of the Lord, not only the commandments, but the instruction and the lore. So the Psalter begins, happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked or walk in the path of sinners, but their delight is in the Torah of the Lord. They meditate on it day and night. The Torah is the entire legacy of being bound in covenantal fidelity and covenantal obedience. And this order provides that personal practice and public policy will cohere with the transcendent purposes of God. The force of Torah aims to resist autonomy, wherein one imagines unfettered freedom without responsibility, freedom to seize what belongs to another because of more power, or freedom to exploit the vulnerable neighbor. In the end, Torah is Israel's testimony to the covenantal shape of social existence, that the world is organized according to steadfast love, that the economy is to be engaged according to neighborly justice, that the political culture is to be shaped by righteousness that is the work of the common good. The entire purpose of liberal arts, I suggest, is to help students situate themselves in a summoning tradition that refuses the autonomy of Enlightenment reason with its concomitant of consumer seduction. The triad of fidelity excuse the seduction of the reasoning of autonomy. It fends off the counter-temptation of absolutism. It refuses absolutism through the ongoing disputatious practice of interpretation, so that the old Torah cannot just be read, and there can be no recourse to the original intention, or what we call originalism, which is to misconstrue the tradition. Thus, it is the great work of the university to nurture competent hermeneutists who refuse the easy relativism of popular culture and who refuse the temptation to absolutism, whether of God or sect or country. The tradition requires interpretive agility that knows that the memory is the beginning point, but never the conclusion. The tradition is always being reformulated in radical contemporaneity with deep rootage that is not deleted by interpretation. Fourth, the triad of fidelity attests to pain, whereas the triad of control specializes in numbness. So the book of Lamentations, is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought on me, which the Lord has inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. The city voices its grief and loss and then notices that the other nations who pass by do not notice. Is it nothing to you? The triad of control, like the priest or the Levite on the way to Jericho, in numbness, do not notice. They pass by on the other side. They have faster errands to run. They have reduced pain to a statistic and suffering to the cost of doing business. The practice of abusive power, exploitative economics, devastating militarism, and the disturbance of the vulnerable of the earth must continue, even if the pain therein produced requires denial. The denial is based on the race to domination, and we cannot afford to linger very long in the hurt. When such denial is pushed far enough, it becomes numbness, what Robert Lifton calls psychic numbing. The alternative to such numbing is to hear and touch and honor the pain that arises from what Lifton calls atrocity-producing policies, systems, and attitude. It is pain that lives beneath the surface of might, wisdom, and wealth. And the triad of fidelity, beginning with the Exodus narrative, has the slaves cry out. And then the narrative says God heard, and God remembered, and God looked, and God took notice, and God came down. The wonder of this triad is that God acts in solidarity. And the story of faith is the story of divine solidarity with human suffering and alliance beyond the drama of control. God bends God's self toward the suffering of Israel and toward the suffering of the world. But of course, this triad of fidelity does not remain at a religious level. We can trace the cry and the holy response as it traverses the world of might and wealth. So right after the Ten Commandments in Exodus 22, Moses comments on that psychic numbness, even though he had not read Lifton, and says, "You shall not oppress the immigrant, you shall not abuse the widow or the orphan, because if you do and they cry out, I will hear them. And if you lend money to my poor people, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest. And if you take your neighbor's cloak in pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down." Imagine doing that with a 30-year loan every night. These two laws in Exodus 22 focus on the vulnerable, who are our primary candidates for pain, always the protection of immigrants and widows and orphans and poor people. The university runs the risk of alliance with the interests of might, wisdom, and wealth, knowledge from above that treats the cry as a necessary inconvenience. It is possible, however, that the university may be a venue in which the long history of the subversive cry is hosted, so that the long literature of truth and hurt is received and honored as a contemporary script. Preoccupation with the cry is natural in the humanities, but is no less urgent in the social sciences, in economics, in the earth sciences, where the earth itself cries out about the abuse. The question that might haunt the university, as it may haunt all of us, is it nothing to you, all of you who pass by? The prophet Amos chronicles this narcoticized self-indulgence. Alas, for all those who lie on beds of ivory and eat lambs from the flock, who sing idle songs and drink bowls from wine and anoint themselves with finest oil, but are not aware that Joseph is going to hell in a handbasket. So much is lost in translation. And that poem ends by saying, "They shall be the first ones to go into exile. Those who do not notice will be displaced, because the cry pulses and the numbing will not prevail." Fifth, the triad of fidelity specializes in dreams that are not held back by circumstance, whereas the triad of control takes life as a present possession to be kept the way it is to perpetuity. The totalizing system of those who make the rules, manage the money, and administer the power, and mobilize their wisdom is everywhere evident among us. That totalizing system aims to maintain advantage. The capacity to control and own to perpetuity is evident through deregulation and by the stacking of cards by law and by predatory management that finally ends in a society that is short on social possibility. So Pharaoh, in his totalizing sovereignty, could finally state in his illusion about himself, "The Nile is my own, I made it." He forgot that the Nile was a gift. And so Jezebel can say to her pouting husband king, "Do you not now govern? Get up and be cheerful, and I will give you his vineyard. Are you not a king? Are you not entitled? Do you not possess the leverage to have what you want?" She imagines that the land is hers to give Ahab. And when she has done her nefarious manipulation, she says to her wimpish husband king, "Go take possession of the vineyard of Naboth, for he is not alive but dead." And the narrator says, as soon as Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, he went and took possession. It's all about realized eschatology, that what we have is permanent, to be secured through seizure and protected through entitlement. And from below comes the cadence of the dream. Dream is always subversive of present arrangement. The dream always intruded into the sleep of Pharaoh, who thought he had everything. And then he dreamed 7 lean cows and 7 blighted shocks of wheat. And Nebuchadnezzar, who had it all, dreamed of a tree being cut down and being driven from his power to insanity. The prophets are voices of God's dream. They say all the time, in that day, the days are coming, the day to come is a day of disarmament when swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. The day is coming when the Lord will act against all Hebrews. This is the text I was reading in class on 9/11. Isaiah 2, for the Lord has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, against all the cedars of Lebanon, against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the high mountains, against the lofty places, against every high hill, against every fortified wall. The days are coming, and they cannot be stopped. They are powered by a holy resolve that is incessantly subversive. And if we trace the dream of subversion, we can follow it from Martin at the Lincoln Monument, where he said repeatedly, I have a dream. And the reason we follow his cadences is that we know that his dream is the dream of our society, writ deep. It is the dream of God for justice, righteousness, and steadfast love. And like all such dreamers, Martin had no clue about here to get from here to there. He only knew that the dream had substance and force and could not be stopped. The trajectory of the poets imagined that the dream is still underway, still overcoming apartheid, still working dignity for the weak, still demanding equity for the poor, still ensuring an end to the systemic violence that we choose to call policy. The university is always deciding how it will serve the forces of possession. In the real world, it must be so, but it must also do other than that and more than that, because the world is not closed in to present power arrangements. The world does not stand still simply because we arrive at our preferred arrangements. And so the dreamers finally were able to say, go tell John that the blind see and the lame walk and the lepers are cleansed and the deaf hear and the dead are raised and the poor have good news, because the dream, the world is always breaking open beyond possession to dream. And the dream continually bites us. Sixth, the triad of fidelity majors in imagination, whereas the triad of control specializes in explanation. Of course, we need both, as we learned from Humboldt and Dilthey. But in a world of technological reductionism, positive reason explanation comes to contain everything. And education consists in mastering the rules and procedures for linear clarity in order to get ahead in the current system. Explanation is a strategy for accumulation of what the system offers. And imagination is the capacity to host a contrast world. So in my discipline of Old Testament studies, historical criticism has been a long-term German enterprise to fit the Bible to the present age. But now we are being led to this post-critical move to discover that the text is so subversive in its imagination. It turns out, as Michael Walzer has shown, that the Exodus narrative is not a report on some ancient happening, and it does not really matter if Pharaoh is Ramses or Merneptah, as we bicker about, because Pharaoh is whoever sits on top of the pyramid. It turns out that the Exodus event was a divine stirring in South Africa, with Egyptian names like Nelson and Desmond. It turns out that the script of steadfast love, justice, and righteousness eventuates in freedom, dignity, and equity, and continues its transformative work. It turns out that the manna story is not simply an ancient story about bread in the wilderness, but it is an act of recognition that all bread is not the property of the cartel who own the granaries and the bakeries. Explanatory education always reads backward about how it was, but imaginative education reads toward unthought possibility, irrefutable surging of newness that is inherent in God's ordering of creation. So our contemporary marching, as they did in Exodus, has run from the freedom rides to the Velvet Revolution to Yeltsin on top of the tank to the march in Selma to hope-filled Cairo and now to the 99%. We are marching, we are marching, we are marching in the light of God. And the narrative is not only performed in the streets, it is performed wherever decision makers gather. But what a vocation for the university to be a school of imagination, to nurture imagination out beyond the blueprints and the programs to new ways of being in the world together. Seventh, the triad of fidelity invites to vocation, whereas the triad of control invites to a career. The triad of control is all about joining the firm, fitting in, and advancing, so that somebody at the club is sure to say, you'll want to look out for this young woman because she is a comer. The pressure of higher education is all about career and how to make a good living, and the university must do that. But the university is not just about making a living. It is about something deeper and more serious than the advancement of might and wealth and wisdom. So the best case study I know is the career of the young Daniel in the book of Daniel, who knew how to work the Babylonian system, and every narrative ends by saying that Daniel got promoted to another office in the Babylonian Empire. But along with all of these promotions, you can see the subtext of the book of Daniel, that he did not give in, he did not forget. And so his three friends, whom we know by their imperial names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are in fact remembered as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah by their Jewish names and their Jewish identities. So education is a struggle for identity. Perhaps we might judge that these four handsome Jews had a double identity, imperial by day and Jewish by night, imperial in the market, Jewish in the synagogue. Or perhaps we may judge that they forgot their Jewish names and identity because they disappear in the narrative. Or perhaps they pretended their career names but knew their baptismal names. Either way, the matter is complex. Either way, education may help people struggle with identity and vocation. It is either the name imposed, the name and the brand imposed by consumer ideology, or it is the preservation of baptismal names assigned to make us, as we say in my church, sealed as Christ's own forever. Education is about name and identity, about true identity and imposed identity. Clearly, the names to which we answer are determined by the triad in which our life is situated, of faith identity amid steadfast love, justice, and righteousness, and empire-given identity amid wisdom, might, and wealth. The issue of identity is very complex. It is clear nonetheless that education that aims only at the totalizing regime of wealth and might will never yield a covenantal identity that can respond outside the box to the divine impetus for mercy, compassion, and generosity. Eighth, finally, it is written in Psalm 19 about God's commandments. More to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter than honey, and the drippings of honeycombs. We might take this statement as an epitome of the two pairs I have tried to exposit. The psalm speaks in many synonyms of Torah: decrees, precepts, commandments, ordinances, and it speaks of many ways to signify the transcendent purpose of God that orders life toward well-being. This offer is better than gold, better than much fine gold, better than honey, better than the drippings from a honeycomb. Imagine, thick guidance to covenantal existence is preferable to gold or honey. Typically, this saying does not say how much better or in what way better, just more desired, more coveted, more treasured, more to be pursued. The Torah is a psalm of steadfast love, justice, and righteousness, as gold is the quick summary of might, wisdom, and wealth. The task of nurture and socialization and education is to invite sustained critical reflection on choosing amid a tradition of folk who have been making that choice forever, sometimes toward death and sometimes toward life. So I finish with three conclusions. First, I am in agreement with that great U.S. theologian Donald Rumsfeld. Only this time. The Secretary of Defense once famously quipped that there are knowns and there are unknowns, and among the unknowns there are known unknowns and unknown unknowns. That's what he said. The comment sounds wiser than it is. And one may wish that Rumsfeld had taken the unknown unknowns more seriously. The unknown unknowns, like Iraq is divided into 3 sects. He didn't know that. So I have been expositing 2 kinds of wisdom: the fast, known wisdom of might, wisdom, and wealth that ends in control, and the slow, unknown of the mystery of God that opens beyond our control, that requires a relational integrity that appears as steadfast love, justice, and righteousness. And education is the disputatious reflection on those wisdoms. Second, I have offered a list of contrasts and complements that exegete slow and fast wisdom: body abstraction, neighborhood club, tradition memo, pain numbness, dream possession, vocation career, imagination explanation, Torah gold. So the argument keeps coming back to the same point. It occurs to me that these several word pairs boil down to the possibility of committed relationships of integrity in the neighborhood that make for the common good, vis-a-vis a mode of life that is hostile to the common good. It occurred to me that the relational covenantal narrative is exactly what we best learn in kindergarten. I will not pursue that, but you can factor it out. So I thought it was mind-boggling to entertain the thought that what properly belongs to kindergarten continues to properly belong to the work of the university, namely to sustain and evoke relational identity for the sake of the common good. Third, the poetry of Jeremiah strikes me as profoundly contemporary among us. As in our time, as in that ancient city, time is very short. We, like that ancient city, are now an anxious society in which everyone is greedy for unjust gain. We, like that ancient city, are now a society against which comes an enduring nation whose language we do not know. We, like that ancient city, are now a society deeply at risk. The poetic response to that risky circumstance seems to me to be completely pertinent now as then. Do not let the wise boast in their wisdom. Do not let the mighty boast in their might. Do not let the wise boast in their wisdom, and the wealthy in their wealth. But let those who boast in this, that they understand and know me, that I am the Lord. I act with steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, says the Lord.
Professor Brueggemann would invite questions and comments from you all. We have microphones down here. If you'll just step up and tell us who you are, invite your comments and questions and affirmations about slow wisdom.
"30 years ago, I read The Prophetic Imagination as a new Christian in college, and it inspired me to think about my vocation as a teacher today. Thank you.
Thank you.
In that work, you talked about the way in which the contemporary church has become captive to consumerism. And I'm wondering, in some ways, whether or not the church-related institution of higher learning, whether college or university, might be capitulating to consumer ethics in your judgment. If that's the case, what can institutions that are committed to slow wisdom and formation of students toward wisdom do to more effectively resist consumptive practice?
Well, that's, as you know, a hard, complex question to which I have no answers. I think that the hard thing is to draw the donor community into the problem. I think there are a lot of campuses, a lot of faculty members, a lot of administrators who want to do this, but you got to kind of do this covertly so that the donors don't find out what you're doing. And I think we are now in such a social crisis that I suspect there is greater readiness about this. It's the same thing in a local congregation. Pastors just hope to hell that people don't understand what we're talking about because it jeopardizes the program and all of that. I think now and in coming days, the crisis is so acute that I expect we're about at readiness for another kind of honesty about that, toward which we have not wanted to move very well because the risks are so great. I think that there is at least an ambiguous recognition that the large commitments we've had really aren't working, and we can at least have a conversation about something else. So I think colleges and universities are cast in a very difficult place because parents do not want their kids majoring in unemployment and so on. So I think it is just broadening and deepening the critical conversation in all the directions that we're able to do.
Thank you. Is this on? Okay. So universities are communities in constant transition where about every 4 or 5 years the entire student population has turned over, which lends itself in the end much more to the conception of its alumni as being part of a club rather than a neighborhood. How do you think that we can, or what are some ways in which we might foster the kind of deep memory that allows students to, once they have left the university, to constitute a neighborhood instead of a club? Something that goes beyond just the impersonality of the intellectual tradition or just sort of the shallowness of sports rivalries and institutional traditions.
Well, I think it's happening in many places, and that is to help students recognize that this is not just a place to be interim, but we are a culture here, and you are now a member of the. This is what campuses are doing. My son is a sociologist at Skidmore College, and he got an assignment, a regular faculty assignment of being a mentor to 10 freshmen. And on his campus, Thursday night drinking is a deep, deep social reality. So he thought that his work was not only to identify that for these freshmen, but to help them think about the fact that they did not have to uncritically conform to that expectation of behavior that was being imposed from above on the freshmen. Now, you know, that's a modest little thing with 10 students, but it seems to me the critical reflection with students about the fact that we are a culture and that we all have responsibility for the health of this culture, rather than I'm just a consumer or a short-term passer through about this, but this is a thing for which I have ongoing responsibility. I think that conversation is on many campuses, but I think we got to do better about that. I think in some ways the conversation in many local congregations has to be like that. Many people who drop by church think they're users, and I'll be here as long as this is convenient, rather than saying you have responsibility for the maintenance and transformation of the culture of this community. So I think we just have to be much more intentional about those things about which we know. That's what I think.
Thank you, Dr. Brueggemann, for a very enjoyable, very enriching talk.
Thank you.
Am I coming through? My name is Michael Jones. I'm from University of Dallas. I have a very simple question, I think. You quoted the passage in which God says that he acts with righteousness, justice, and steadfast love, and he delights in these. I was just asking, wondering how you distinguish justice and righteousness.
How I distinguish them?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know how to do that. You know, I think they're, as you know, they are a word pair and they travel together. It is, I think it is common to say that justice maybe is the horizontal side of social relations and righteousness is the God connection, but I don't think Hebrew words factor out according to our definitions about that. So I incline to think that all of those steadfast love, mercy, compassion, righteousness, and so on, I think they're all, and I always say, rough synonyms. So if you don't like it, I emphasize rough. and then you can factor
Thank
it
you.
out.
I'm struck by the fact that your presentation was essentially chiastic, and just like you said about these words being rough synonyms, that you said the same thing 8 different ways, and that your field of study and your focus on the prophetic imagination lent itself to structuring your presentation in this way. And I would assume that the implication is that whatever our field of study be, that we let that inform the way that we make this proclamation or this plea. Is that fair?
I think that's right. I would not presume to suggest how someone in some discipline about which I don't know anything ought to do that. I just think that there are no disciplines that are not impinged upon by the crisis we're in, but how that then gets exhibited and so on and processed, I think it requires great freedom and great imagination to do that. And it may be that in the Old Testament, if I had worked with the wisdom traditions for a wisdom conference rather than the prophetic traditions, it might have come out differently. But I think across the different genres of the Old Testament text, it always comes down to this radical either-or, when in fact we don't live our lives according to radical either-ors. We live our lives according to ambiguous processing. But I have the conviction that if the radical or either-or isn't laid out with some clarity, then we cannot properly perceive the ambiguities with which we struggle. But yes to that. Yep. Okay.
Please join me again.